Hello everybody. This morning I'd like to talk about the reading for week 4, which is Belinda Smith reading on How Might Information Bolster Anti-Discrimination Laws to Promote Family-Friendly Workplaces. This article is a little bit different from the articles you've been reading, and as you'd realise, it's coming from the perspective of the law. So Belinda Smith is writing from an understanding of law and legislation rather than an HR article per se. But the reason that I wanted you to read this article, and I do stress that you should read this selectively, do not try and get into the detail of the law and of the arguments. I'll tell you what you need to know to get out of this article in this little video and also in the lecture. So the reason I've asked you to read it is because it provides a link between HRM and the law in a way that shows how complex it is to develop policies and practices that don't discriminate, but also it shows how important HR is in terms of developing policies and practices that create equitable and fair workplaces. Belinda Smith really doesn't get to the point of her article till midway through the paper, where what she's wanting to argue is that discrimination does occur, and it occurs out of the way in which policies and practices are written, and also it occurs because people make faulty assumptions, use faulty stereotypes, and that results in the fact that people get discriminated against. Often with the best of intentions not to discriminate, but people get discriminated against because of faulty stereotypes, particularly gender stereotypes, and therefore we need to think about ways in which we can ensure that the law is complied with, and one way of doing that is by providing information to people in organisations or given organisations capacity to ensure that discrimination doesn't occur. From an HR perspective, this is important because we need to understand how to implement policy that is inclusive. From a resource-based view of the firm, if we discriminate against half of the workforce, say discriminate against women with caring responsibilities, then we're not using our human resources to their full capacity. So organisations that have a reputation for discrimination or for not treating women or marginalised groups. We talked about students last week in terms of 7-Eleven. Organisations aren't able to achieve sustained competitive advantage. If organisations can achieve a reputation for being equitable and fair and developing innovative policies to be inclusive, and developing an inclusive culture, this might be something that provides them with competitive advantage compared to their competitors. So this idea of developing policies and practices that are fair and equitable is a key aspect of human resource management, and that's really what I want you to get out of the article. Smith talks about a couple of key concepts which are important that we'll talk about in the lecture this week, and then following the following lecture on diversity and managing diversity, we'll build on these ideas as well. So she talks about the ideal worker, and the ideal worker gets discussed a lot in the literature around gender discrimination. And what the ideal worker is a stereotype built on a male breadwinner model. The idea that the male in the household goes out to work, the female in the household stays home and looks after the children and looks after the household. It's a very outdated stereotype, but it's a stereotype that's alive and well in many organisations. And this is often why organisations are viewed as family unfriendly, because the ideal worker is the idea of an unencumbered male that comes to work, that is not concerned about needing family-friendly practices, is endlessly available, can do overtime at short notice, can travel at short notice, doesn't require any kind of adjustment to participate in the workforce. And of course, this is a faulty gender stereotype because it discounts females' participation, and often it discounts many male participations. I mean, most of you may well have parents that both work and have both shared the care responsibilities of picking you up from school or taking you to sport, taking you to the doctor during the school week, and so on as you grew up. And so if you assume an ideal worker works in your organisation, you're automatically discriminating or making decisions based on an inaccurate or some would say false stereotype. So assuming outdated stereotypes, for example, the ideal worker, is a problem for the resource-based view perspective. If employees are discriminated against or excluded, then the organisation may not be utilising those human resource assets to the fullest extent. So women that can't get flexibility may not choose to work at a particular kind of organisation. They may leave, they may claim discrimination, take the organisation to court. They may be less productive, they may be feeling more conflicted because they can't get flexibility that they need to manage their work and life. And so this in turn may affect the way in which organisations can attract and retain the brightest and the best workers. The brightest and the best workers aren't always male workers, it's a mixture of male and female workers. She also talks about direct discrimination. And in HR, we do directly discriminate against people in recruiting and attracting and recruiting particular kinds of people to the organisation. But that's done on the basis of their ability to do their job, not on the basis of their caring responsibilities or that they're male or female. And so direct discrimination is treating people differently because of certain characteristics. And so organisations can be accused of direct discrimination against women if they are making selection decisions or promotion decisions based on women's availability. So, for example, not promoting someone because they're a part-time worker may well be a direct discrimination against part-time workers. And she also talks about indirect discrimination. And that's the idea of treating people the same regardless of their characteristics. And this can be problematic as well. So, for example, if you say, well, we're all equal in this organisation, we're going to treat everybody the same, assumes that everybody comes to work under the same circumstances. And again, the example of women and the example of the ideal worker stereotype, men and women don't come to work under the same circumstances. Our society is still arranged with the female carer and the male breadwinner stereotype or arrangement. I mean, the women still do the lion's share of care in the organisation, and so that they need particular accommodations because of those caring responsibilities. Smith also moves on to the idea of unconscious bias, which is also quite a popular concept that's used when talking about equity and anti-discrimination. And this is where people aren't conscious of the biases and the values that they hold, and so that they make decisions and they're unaware that they might be discriminating. Certainly when it's pointed out to them, they'll go, oh, of course, and then maybe think about changing the decisions that they make. So you can see with all of these ideas that this is central to what human resource management does, and it's very key in managing people in an equitable and fair way. And it may also be organisations that do this really well, maybe a source of sustained competitive advantage. And we have examples of organisations like IBM that are very focused on diversity and very focused on treating people in an inclusive way in order to get the best and the brightest people to work for them. So what to do about all of this? Well, Smith offers a framework that looks at organisations committedness or commitment to compliance with anti-discrimination law, and the capacity to understand how current practices may discriminate, and then also the capacity to develop new and innovative policies that are more inclusive and are able to create an equitable and fair workplace. So it's clear from the resource-based view of the firm and the Verio model of competitive advantage that those organisations that are able to develop inclusive and non-discriminatory practices are not only able to attract a broader range of highly skilled and motivated employees, they are likely to create a culture of inclusion that makes employees engaged, committed and productive. This may give organisations sustained competitive advantage. To achieve this, Smith goes on to argue that organisations should use or must use different types of information resources to translate the law, provide guidance for action and policy development, and also best practice cases. So managers or supervisors can read what other organisations have done to be more inclusive, and this might inform how they manage their employees. I think it's worth quoting Smith from page 560, and this is the reason that we're reading this article this week. The kinds of discrimination that remains today are often bedded in organisational practices and values. These can be subconscious, they can be habitual. This means that in designing effective regulations to address discrimination, and that's from the legal side of things, we need to acknowledge and harness the power and control organisations have over their internal practices and cultures. And I take this to mean human resource management and what we've been learning about in the last 3 weeks. This article can be used in response to your in-class essay as an argument for, and also an argument that explains why organisations often don't treat their employees well, because that they may not have the capacity for or the commitment to anti-discrimination practices. I mean, clearly the 7-Eleven example, that organisation as a whole and perhaps the franchisees had no difficulty in exploiting those marginalised workers, the international student workers. I mean, they didn't have the law in mind when they were treating those workers, and so they neither had the commitment or, well, we don't know whether they could have the capacity. Time will tell about that. Okay, so that's the Smith reading for this week.